Thank you, everybody, for being here with us today. We really appreciate that you are taking the time to join us for Connections Live, our Noetic webinar series designed to help you deepen your sense of interconnection, to inform and to inspire. And we're so glad you're here today. So thank you for tuning in to hear our special guest, Mitch Horowitz, for What Parapsychology Reveals About the Powers of Intention. My name is Kirsten Sjoquist. I'm the Director of Experience and Engagement at IONS, and I'll be your host today for our 90 minutes together. We have back-end Zoom support from our program coordinator, Elena Brown, who will help you out with any technical difficulties you may have during our time together. Just send a chat to host and panelists, and she'll get right back to you. And we are recording this webinar. The video will be posted on our website later today. Elena is sharing that link in the chat so you can rewatch today's presentation and share it with others. This recording will be available to all on our website at that link for the next 2 weeks. And then, as with all of our Connections Live recordings, it will be available to IONS members in the Media for Members section of our website. Membership is just $60 a year. And as a scientific nonprofit, our funding is entirely from membership and donations. So we're so grateful for your support. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Mitch Horowitz. Mitch is an historian of alternative spirituality and one of today's most literate voices of esoterica, mysticism, and the occult. He is a writer in residence at the New York Public Library and is an PEN award-winning author whose books include Occult America, One Simple Idea, The Miracle Club, Daydream Believer, Uncertain Places, and the forthcoming Modern Occultism. Mitch worked for many years in publishing, including as a vice president at Penguin Random House, where he was editor-in-chief of Tarcher Penguin, an imprint dedicated to metaphysical topics. And I have been a huge fan of Mitch's work for many, many years now, and I'm absolutely tickled that he's here today. His work is really grounded in deep research, and he gives valuable historical perspective to invisible practices that still continue to permeate our culture. And he's not only a scholar, but a practitioner. And he shares a lot of his own journey of exploring and using mind power techniques with a real sense of authenticity and transparency that I really appreciate. He is also, in my opinion, one of the few people who openly addresses the weaknesses or deficiencies of some of these philosophies that have sprung up around these practices, particularly as they relate to our current times. So I could go on and on, but I'll stop for now. You can find all kinds of fascinating things on Mitch's website at mitchhorowitz.com. So welcome, Mitch. Thank you for being here today and sharing your expertise, and the Zoom stage is all yours.
Thank you so much, Kirsten, and thank you for the invitation to speak to the IONS community. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. There's a great many of us on this program today from all over the world. I noticed Alexander is here from Ukraine, and I want to say to Alexander that you know that speaking for myself, and I think all of us who are part of this program today, our deepest wishes go out to you for the freedom and sovereignty of your nation. And I appreciate you taking the time to be here. And a thanks to all of you for being here. It's very special to be able to speak to the IONS community today because I see IONS as a heroic institution on the Western landscape. IONS has kept alive a critically important research program in parapsychology, supported by members and private funders. As many of you are probably aware, the research that goes on at IONS into parapsychology is not supported by any academic institution. Once in a while, there may be public grants, but as any of you know who have applied for grants, that's a full-time occupation in itself to a great extent. And the researchers and clinicians who make up the IONS research apparatus have to do a great deal of private fundraising. So I appreciate your being here with us. I encourage you to support the good work that the organization is doing. I am, by profession, a historian of alternative spirituality, but I also write about spirituality from a practical perspective. And my definition of the spiritual is simply the extra physical. I'm very comfortable using the term spirituality, but at the same time, whenever I do use it, I could just as easily be saying extra physicality, because to me, it's essentially the two are essentially synonymous. And I remember years ago when I was writing my second book, a book called One Simple Idea, which is a history of the positive mind movement in the Western world. I got very interested in the original work done at Duke University's parapsychology lab by J.B. Rhine and Louisa Rhine in the early 1930s. And the reason I grew interested in that work and have remained dedicated to and interested in that early elementary pioneering work into parapsychology is this. As many of you are probably aware, at Duke in the early 1930s, the Rhines and their colleagues pioneered a series of card tests with cards known as Zener cards, a 5-suit deck of cards designed by psychologist Carl Zener, with very familiar symbols, a cross, squiggly lines, a triangle, a circle, so on, that would allow for very simple, but also very rigorously designed statistical tests for some kind of anomalous transfer of information in a laboratory setting. And in short, the Zener card tests, which are really the classical experiments that began academic ESP research in the United States and in much of the world, involve very simply a subject venturing a guess of one of 5 images that appeared in these in a suit of Zener cards. And so naturally you have a 1 in 5 or 20% chance of getting a correct hit over time. And over the course of many thousands of trials, JB discovered that there were subjects who were persistently and trackably scoring above this chance hit rate of 20%. They might be scoring 25%, 26%, 28%, in some remarkable instances, a great deal higher. But there were subjects who were consistently violating the law of averages, so to speak. We don't really like to speak in terms of a law of averages nowadays. It's more of a colloquial concept because sometimes it gets misapplied in gambling situations. But in fact, the colloquialism is true. Over thousands of trials, a chance hit rate of 20% when you're dealing with 1 in 5 targets will pretty much hold steady. And JB and Louisa continually found evidence of subjects rigorously tested across tens of thousands of trials. In fact, there were a million trials in the Rhine database by 1940, less than 10 years after they commenced the original Duke experiments, that demonstrated anomalous transfer of information in a lab setting, or what we call ESP, extrasensory perception. And I was very struck by the quality of these experiments because, as I've often written, if parapsychology as a field had stopped right then and there and no further research was done, and believe me, there are plenty of people in the professional skeptics community who wish for that outcome, they did not get their wish. But if parapsychology as a field had been stillborn right at that point, we would still have evidence, rock solid, bulletproof, replicable evidence that has been juried, that has been repeated, that has been reviewed, that has been validated in meta-analyses and replicatory experiments at other universities and other clinical labs. We would have that evidence for the existence of an extra-physical capacity of the psyche. Just going back to the 1930s, reliant upon the statistical data that came out of the Rhine lab alone. Of course, now here we are almost a century on, and we have lots and lots of other data and testimony, verifiable testimony, which has deepened the ESP thesis, the extrasensory thesis. But if we had stopped right then and there, more than 2 generations ago, we would have evidence of there being an extra physical capacity to the psyche. And that evidence has become so precious and so important today because the sciences, as of this moment, we're speaking in the early spring of 2023, the sciences have opened to the extra physical in ways that I don't think we in the modern world have ever seen before. There has been a modern scientific apparatus here in the West for well over the past 300 or so years. And by modern scientific apparatus, again, let me define my terms. I mean something very, very simple. Methodological replication. That's what science is. I sometimes have to smile when I see the word science bandied about in the media as if it's the materialist equivalent of the tablets from Mount Sinai. It's not exactly that. It is data resultant from a process of methodological replication. It's that simple. It has authority, such data has authority, and such data deserves authority, but we mustn't get carried away, as some of the people in the materialist crowd do, with invoking science as something that serves to end all arguments or sources of contention, because it doesn't. It's data that's gathered under very strict conditions, and it ought to be honored as such. But it's not something that should be given a kind of status of secular religiosity. And Rhine did that. Rhine did that. He produced data demonstrating that the psyche, which I see as a compact of intellect and emotion, the psyche has extra physical capacity. And he opened the door to so many questions in doing that, including practical questions. And I get very interested in the practical questions of parapsychology research. I'm interested in all facets of it, but I do think that those of us who consider ourselves on the spiritual path today, those of us who are involved in a search for ethical and existential meaning, those of us who are interested in the manner in which our spiritual practices might inform the quality of our relationships, of our day-to-day experiences, of our concrete experiences, such as in matters of addiction recovery, such as in areas of just being a better member of a relationship circle, or in areas of life where you really need to get somewhere, where you have problems that may be of a financial nature, that may be of a relationship nature. Suffering from crushing loneliness, suffering from financial anxiety is no joke. And these things, I believe, ought to be part of the spiritual process in as much as they're part of the therapeutic process. If spirituality as a broad-based search for human meaning and human understanding doesn't include the practical, then, well, I think we've excluded the areas that we live in most frequently from our search. And I think that would be a tragedy for the individual. So I take the practical dimension of spirituality very seriously. One of the things that I was struck by in J.B. Rhine's work, and I'm going to be dealing with more contemporary work shortly, but I view J.B. as an intellectual hero. I want to start with his work and spend a little time on it. One of the things that I always valued in JB's work, but that I also found occasionally frustrating, was that as a scientist, he was so ethically driven that he refused to extrapolate from his work. And that was a trait in him that I admired, although as a lay student of his work, I also found that trait sometimes frustrating, because I think that JB at times could be conservative, clinically conservative, almost to a fault, where he was so dedicated to the ethic of not waxing fanciful about his data or his numbers that I think sometimes he neglected to take steps that actually might have been helpful to future generations, such as theorizing a possible delivery system for ESP, or for anomalous transfer of information. Maybe venturing a theory of the metaphysics behind the conveyance of data, something that I, as a lay writer, have attempted to do in my work. And hopefully I'll have time to touch on that before we're done with today's session. I thought he could be a little too conservative sometimes. I recognize the ethic that it came from. And on the rare occasions when JB would extrapolate from his work, I paid very, very keen attention, because those ventures, those extrapolations beyond the hard data were rare, and he would do so with great care. And I always thought it warranted attention. He did this in the afterword to a British edition of his 1934 monograph, Extrasensory Perception, the book that made ESP into a household term, I suppose. He wrote in this afterword that he and his collaborators noticed that conditions under which ESP would spike, and in fact, conditions under which there would be any results at all, usually hinged upon a prevailing sense of comity in the lab, of collegiality, of good spirits, of enthusiasm, of hopeful expectancy, of a willingness and an expectation to try the experiment with some reasonable assurance that there would be results. And the opposite traits tended to cause results to dip. An atmosphere of a coarse or excessive skepticism, an atmosphere of disagreeableness or fatigue would cause results to spike. To dip. And this could be compensated for. If a subject took a break, had a cup of coffee, maybe went out and had a meal or had a conversation with people. We don't smoke too much anymore nowadays, probably good, but had a smoke, something that contributed to an atmosphere of comity and relaxation. Again, results would boost. And Carl Jung took very careful notice of this, such that in his famous essay on synchronicity, Jung mentioned that Rhine observed that high spirits created the circumstances, the atmosphere under which there would be any results at all. And I was very taken by this, because I thought this really, in maybe about 15 years before modern placebo studies really got up and running, at least here in the United States, this observation, which JB made so quietly in the afterword to the British edition of his book, this was the same observation that came to be validated in placebo studies. The trigger for the placebo effect seems to be, at least when that placebo effect is therapeutic in nature, because I think we've seen enough data so that we understand that what we call the placebo effect, a belief-based physical effect, is going on constantly. It's omnipresent. It could be for the good, it could be for the bad, but it's omnipresent. But a therapeutically gainful placebo effect hinges on hopeful expectancy. As in ESP research, as in placebo research, hopeful expectancy is the pivot point that determines whether there are going to be any results at all. And when I first began to connect these dots, I mentioned I was writing a book called One Simple Idea, which was a history of the positive mind movement in the Western world. And so I began to ask myself, well, if parapsychology and if placebo research is telling us that a desired response, whether it be therapeutic or whether it be informational, can be spiked by the presence of hopeful expectancy, where does this hopeful expectancy come from? And can it be engendered? Is it healthful to engender it? You know, the fact is, in the field of placebo studies, some clinicians have had ethical misgivings about the field because much of placebo studies, until very recently, have involved what might be considered a kind of beneficent deception. The individual, the subject, believes that he or she is getting a therapeutic substance, whereas they're receiving a sugar pill, so to speak. They're receiving something that's considered clinically inert. Placebo surgeries, for example, have been found to create valid therapeutic responses. This was validated in the early 1980s at a veterans medical hospital in Houston, where patients who were suffering from arthritic knees were divided into two groups. One group was given a kind of spectroscopic knee surgery that's very, it's tough surgery. It's tough surgery on the body, requires a lot of recovery time. Cartilage is scraped out of the knee is sewn back up, and there's many, many, many weeks of physical therapy before you fully recover. It's tough on the body. But one group, a placebo group, was given a benign incision, told that they received this knee surgery, and they had the same therapeutic benefits as the patients who had received the actual surgery, with a much, much shorter recovery time because they didn't get the full treatment. They didn't have to go through the arduous weeks of physical therapy. They just received a benign incision. And it raised the question among the clinicians as to whether the benefits of this surgery at all were perhaps entirely attributable to what we call a placebo effect. So we've had extraordinary advances in the placebo effect over the past generation. I'm touching on just one, but it does involve deception. Patients expected to be receiving the surgery, and the folks who experienced the placebo effect only received a benign incision, a beneficent deception, but deception no less. So I began to wonder, and I began to ask myself, do we have ways of engendering this kind of hopeful expectancy, or these physical effects? And of course, there are popular spiritual philosophies in our world that prescribe methods to engender this hopeful expectancy, using affirmations, visualizations, mantras, things of this nature. But I personally have found that the effectiveness of those things can be very limited by a person's physical and emotional circumstances. When an individual is driven to his or her knees by grief or depression, or for that matter, legitimate fear. And let us not forget, who among us would have the temerity to say that there aren't legitimate fears? Well, of course they are. Of course there are. Of course there are legitimate fears. So people who are suffering from states of acute anxiety or depression or grief or addiction might find, as I've found, that it's very, very difficult to use your psyche or use some of the traditionally prescribed exercises to enter and to rearrange your feeling state, thereby cultivating this mood of hopeful expectancy, maybe key to a certain image or a wish for a certain outcome, or something of that nature. And it would seem to me that Mother Nature has played a kind of cruel joke on us. If those moments when we're in deepest need, it's the most difficult period in which to rearrange our psyches so as to arrive at this feeling state. But here again, parapsychology provides us with an extremely important hint and possibility. In the early 20th century, there was a French mind theorist who I'm sure some of you have heard of, named Emil Coué. He lived in northwestern France and was quite popular in Europe and the United States in the 19-teens and 1920s. He died in 1926 for a mantra that he prescribed that goes day by day, in every way, I'm getting better and better. That was Coué's mantra. And of course, the critics were merciless towards Coué and said, oh boy, what mature adult, what sensitive adult could possibly believe that such a childish nursery rhyme method could make a difference in anybody's life? And as much as Coué was admired, he was also pilloried in the media by his critics. But what was overlooked was the fact that Coué had a particular method for using this mantra of his. And Coué's method, which he was very keen on describing, and he was very exacting and precise in advising use of, was that you recite this mantra of his 20 times to yourself in a slight whisper just before drifting to sleep at night, and again another 20 times just as coming to in the morning. And Coué showed a remarkable instinct for a very supple, very flexible state of mind that is today referred to by parapsychologists and neurologists and sleep researchers as hypnagogia. This hypnagogic state is a state in which the psyche hovers between a standard wakefulness and sleep. It's an in-between state, a very mysterious in-between state, where our brain demonstrates activities associated both with standard cognition and REM sleep simultaneously. It's really remarkable. And when you're in this naturally meditative, deeply relaxed state, you experience tremendous physical stillness. You might even experience a comfortable bodily paralysis. You experience oral and visual hallucinatory images, surrealistic images, almost like a bending clock from a Salvador Dali painting. And yet you're able to direct your cognition. You're self-aware. And you're able to direct your attention, even as you're experiencing some of the sensations and the brain activity of REM sleep. And Coué instinctively understood that this state of mind is prime time, so to speak, for reconditioning or reprogramming the psyche, because your rational defenses are down. It could also be a time of tremendous pain. You know, people who are going through periods of suffering like grief will sometimes describe the wee hours of the morning, for example, as the most difficult time of day. People who suffer from anxiety in general very frequently find that the early hours of the morning, sometimes referred to as hypnopompia, that was a term that the psychical researcher Frederick Myers coined. Hypnagogia and hypnopompia are very similar. There's maybe more of a hallucinatory aspect to hypnagogia, and I use the term hypnagogia both for the morning and evening states. I don't like to get overly wrapped up in terminology unless it's necessary. But the morning state is sometimes called hypnopompia. Thank you to Frederick Myers. Those of you who suffer from anxiety may be able to relate well to this. The hypnopompic state, the early morning state, again, where you're gravitating between wakefulness and sleep, between cognition and a REM dreamlike state. For those suffering from anxiety, that can be the most difficult time of day because the rational defenses are down and stuff that you're afraid of, whether it's something at work or some task that you have to do, it appears like a dragon because we're unable to view it with proportion and perspective. So it may just be a little gremlin, but it appears like a dragon. So these states that I'm describing, these hypnagogic states that I'm describing, they can be hurtful or helpful for the same reason. The rational defenses are down. The psyche tends toward hallucination or dreamlike visions. But cognition functions. And that means that when you're in that state, you can use Coué's mantra or a mantra of your own. You can visualize, you can pray, you can goal set. And it's a unique time to reprogram the psyche, so to speak. I'll use that as a metaphor. I never neglected. I never neglected those precious moments just before drifting to sleep at night, just as coming to in the morning. I use that twice a day to, again, visualize, affirm, recite a mantra, set a goal. And I think something else is going on during this period too, and I'm going to get to it in 1 second. I want to mention one other thing about Coué. Coué was not only a mind theorist, but by profession, he was a pharmacist. He worked in a town called Troyes in northwestern France. And Coué had, in addition to an extraordinary early instinct for hypnagasia, as I'm describing it. Oh, someone asked how to spell Coué, C-O-U-E. And he not only had an instinct for hypnagogia, as I'm describing it, but he also had an early instinct for placebo studies. Coué made the observation in the early 1900s, when he was working as a druggist, that if he spoke to his clients of the benefits of a certain drug, a certain admixture of medicine that he was working up, almost invariably, clients would come back and speak to him of spiked results with that drug. And he came to feel that if a patient was given positive and accurate information about the therapeutic benefits of the drug, anecdotally, and I take anecdote very seriously, anecdote is testimony. Anecdotally, patients would come back and report improved outcomes with the drug. Now, in 2013, Harvard University, which has a very innovative program at its med school for studying the placebo effect, conducted an experiment that affirmed Coué's instincts. It conducted an experiment using a migraine drug, and it was a standard drug, a drug with recognized therapeutic benefits. But the Harvard researchers divided the subjects of the study into two groups: one that received the migraine drug, business as usual, okay, and one that received the migraine drug and were also given positive and accurate information about the drug's benefits. That group did better with the drug, which can lead to the conclusion that what we call the placebo effect is ever operative. It's going on all the time. Now, I spoke with Ted Kapchuk, who's in charge of the program in placebo studies at Harvard Medical School, and I asked him whether the researchers were standing on the shoulders of Emil Coué when they structured this study. Now, he had heard of Coué, which I was glad to discover, because many contemporary clinicians have not heard of Coué. And he knew right away what I was talking about. He said, sure, day by day in every way, I'm getting better and better. And he said, no, they were not thinking of Coué when they designed the study, but he agreed with me that their findings seemed to comport with Coué's own. And Coué was operating again on instinct. That's why I have such love and admiration for this man. His instinct in the direction of placebo studies, his instinct in the direction of hypnagogia, decades in advance of the clinical study of some of these things, turned out to be spot on correct. Now, dig this. So we have Emil Coué, okay? We have an understanding now. We have a term for this near sleep state that he was describing and prescribing using the recitation of mantras or affirmations or what have you. But fast forward to the 1970s and 80s, and parapsychology again gives us a new wrinkle to this remarkable dynamic paradigm that Coué and others had etched out. The great Charles Honorton, who I see as a direct inheritor to the work of J.B. Rhine. Sadly, Rhine and Honorton seem never to have really gotten along well as individuals. I don't think Rhine fully understood Honorton's genius when he first met Honorton as a kind of teen prodigy. Honorton started interning at the Duke Parapsychology Lab, which was then off campus, at about age 15. And Honorton was already designing some of his own experiments with clinical integrity and expertise in his late teens. He attended the University of Minnesota, never completed the PhD program there, which was a source of tension between him and Rhine. And Honorton had some different priorities than JB did. JB was specifically interested in studying the question of ESP among choice subjects who seemed to be possessed perhaps of a special gift in the direction of ESP. And these were subjects in a conscious waking state. Charles Honorton, the younger parapsychologist, was interested in studying conditions of ESP among the general population. JB had said, well, look, before determining or trying to determine whether ESP is generally dispersed among everyone, let's see if it exists among anyone. So those were his priorities. And Honorton, as a means of studying whether ESP existed generally among the population, felt that hypnosis or some sort of altered state of consciousness could be useful to get people into a sufficiently relaxed mode so that maybe other stimuli or other emotional and mental concerns wouldn't be crowding out the signal, so to speak. Again, I'm speaking in metaphor because we don't really know what's going on precisely, but we need to speak generally, so I'll use metaphors from time to time. Now, this was Honorton's way of trying to cultivate the circumstances under which ESP results seemed to spike in the lab. And Honorton devised a series of experiments known as the Ganzfeld experiments, Ganzfeld being German for whole field or open field. And Honorton theorized to great result that we might see a spike in ESP-related activity if you could place a person into comfortable conditions of hypnagasia. Again, hearkening back to Coué's instinctive observation, discovery. And so Honorton and his colleagues designed their Ganzfeld experiments so that you took two subjects, a so-called sender and a so-called receiver. So these would be experiments in what we would call telepathy. And the so-called receiver would be seated in maybe an isolation tank or a noise-proof room, and he or she would be placed into conditions of comfortable sensory deprivation. So, for example, the individual might be put into a reclining chair, like a lazy boy recliner. He or she might be fitted with headphones that emit white noise or that block out noise. Might be fitted with eye shades so that they're in conditions of total darkness. And the idea is that you want to take a waking person and put that individual into a state of comfortable, relaxed sensory deprivation, thereby inducing the state of hypnagogia. And then, once the receiver is nice and relaxed, outside the Depro tank or the Depro booth or the soundproof room, you have another person who is known as a sender. And this sender is trying to convey one of four images to the person seated within the Depro tank. And then the person in the Depro tank is going to try to make a hit on which image is being sent. So there's one authentic image and three decoy images. So in this instance, not dissimilar to the Zener cards, there's a 25% chance of getting a correct hit by guesswork. So a 1 in 4 chance. And over thousands and thousands of trials, what Honorton found, and he collaborated with many different people at many different labs, these experiments were widely replicated. What Honorton and his collaborators found was that they were getting results that were pooled, crunched, meta-analyzed, that were actually slightly superior to the results that JB had gotten at Duke. There was a 25% chance hit rate, and over thousands and thousands of trials, people were getting hits to the tune of 37%, 36%, 38%. It was kind of hovering around that area, which statistically is enormously substantial. This data became so substantial, so remarkable, so heavily juried and vetted that, as I've often written about, for the first time in modern parapsychology history, and perhaps the last as of this year, I'm sorry to say, Honorton actually collaborated with an avowed career skeptic whose name Ray Hyman, who's a emeritus professor of psychology at the University of Oregon. Hyman is still living, and the two collaborated on a meta-analysis of dozens of experiments following the Ganzfeld protocols. And while they disagreed on the validity of the ESP thesis, the skeptic and the parapsychologist issued a joint statement avowing that the data was unpolluted. The data was absolutely valid according to the highest standards of statistical analysis. There was no evident corruption in the data, and that earlier methods of data gathering had been corrected, and that this was high quality, trackable data that warranted further research. And that's all. No statement on Hyman's behalf affirming ESP. Hyman has never said any such thing, and venture never will. But he did agree that this data was absolutely valid and that further research was warranted. Unfortunately, Charles Honorton, the parapsychologist, had suffered from lifelong health struggles, and he died several years later at the young age of 46 in 1992. And his contributions to the field were brought to an unfortunately early end at a very, very young age. I've written that it would be similar to having lost Einstein at the inception of his relativity theories. It's a terrible, terrible loss for the field. But what Honorton has left us, even with these few years of Ganzfeld experiments, have given us an understanding that ESP does appear to exist under the right conditions within a broad spectrum of the population, because unlike JB, Honorton was not looking for subjects who were uniquely talented in the area, but everyday people. And under these conditions of sensory deprivation, there seemed to be a spike in anomalous transfer of information. And so it suggests to me that when we are working with affirmations, visualizations, mantras, and so forth during the hypnagogic state, which can be induced, as Honorton demonstrated, but look, also occurs naturally 2 times a day when you're drifting to sleep and when you're coming to in the morning, even if you have trouble with meditation. So long as at some point or another you're sleeping, you're going through this twice in a 24-hour period, roughly. That state is prime time, so to speak, for ESP-related activity. And I mean, when we speak in terms of the possibilities of thought, we don't really know precisely what's going on. I'm very interested in new thought, or the question of mind causation. I don't use terms like manifestation or law of attraction. I use terms like selection because I'm very interested. Whole other question entirely. We could have a different talk on it, and I'd be delighted to come back and deliver one. But there are questions about different intersections of time, different dimensions of time, which are logically emergent from the past century or so of quantum mechanics data, which theories like string theory try to explain and model out and map out. And these ideas also coalesce with questions of the placebo response, mind-body medicine, parapsychology, mental causation, because it may be that the psyche is capable, at least under certain choice conditions or moments, of moving among these different intersections of time and possibly selecting things that are actually experienced. And this sense of experience, which is quite real, more than just a sense, but this phenomena of experience is untethered by notions of past, present, future. It's non-linear, just as Einstein's theories, which have now been proven, have demonstrated to us that time itself is nonlinear. So there's all kinds of tantalizing possibilities with respect to the extraphysical capacities of the mind and what's going on when there seems to be connection between thought and event, or emotion and event. There may be, in certain cases, a kind of selectivity going on. It's possible, based on what we know at this point, that this hypnagogic state is prime time for that potential of selectivity, of mental selectivity. We know that it's real in the most empirical sense of the term. We know that it's real. We know that there's all kinds of diffuse and different brainwave activity going on during hypnagogia. So even a materialist could love that. Okay. And we know that there's a therapeutic benefit to the usage of the hypnagogic state. I think we've seen enough so that we know that. We know from Honorton's Ganzfeld experiments that there's an extra-physical quality, an extrasensory, a telepathic quality that's trackable by replicable experiment, clinical circumstance, and data going on during the hypnagogic state. So those of us who are interested in a little practical philosophy, don't we owe it to ourselves to experiment with that state? Don't we owe it to ourselves? So that to me is a very practical prospect that emerges from parapsychology and that coalesces with other fields. And I'm going to mention one more. Which is the most recent, and that is the precognition experiments conducted by Darrell Bem, a psychologist at Cornell University, and published in his paper Feeling the Future in the year 2011. Bem's experiments are so important and so remarkable. And I write about them at some length in a recent book that I've published called Daydream Believer. And I really value Bem's experiments into precognition, which I'm going to describe in brief. I value them because Bem, spelled B-E-M, Darrell Bem, easiest last name on earth. Bem, well, I'll put it to you this way. He demonstrated something that I think appeared in a quote from the pioneering parapsychologist and chemist William Crookes in the 1870s. In the 1870s, William Crookes, who was one of the founders of modern parapsychology and also one of the founding members of the Society for Psychical Research, Crookes said, with respect to his research into the parapsychological, he said, I didn't say it was possible. I only said it was true. And I think that Bem's data captures the ideal and the veracity of what Crookes was trying to get across in that statement. And Bem's data also, I think, demonstrates, along with work by many other clinicians who time alone keeps me from referencing, has demonstrated the continued urgency of parapsychology research. Anyway, for those of you who don't know Bem's work, I'm going to be super brief, but accurate. Bem conducted a series of 10 experiments into precognition. And his most remarkable experiments in the series, and he spent about a decade working on this, were experiments 9 and 10, in which he demonstrated that future study of a word list had cognitive benefits in the present. So this is how Bem essentially structured the experiment I'm going to describe to you. I referenced the 10 experiments. I beg your pardon, it was 9. Describing experiments 8 and 9. Bem structured a standard cognitive test where subjects were given a list of words to memorize, and then they were tested on their retention. And their scores were the average scores that you might expect. You're given a list of 10 words to memorize, and then shortly thereafter, tested on your retention. You may recall 5 or 6 of them, something in that neighborhood. So Bem did this test, and he then added to it a unique wrinkle, very simple wrinkle, but done so under greatly rigorous and careful circumstances. The subjects were then given their memorization test, results logged from the memorization test, and after the memorization test, they were asked to study the word list again. In those instances where they studied the word list again post-test, the scores spiked in a statistically significant fashion. So dig this. Okay. You're given a list of words to memorize. You get your list, you do your memorization, your score is recorded. Okay, we're all set. Now, we're going to do the same experiment again. You're given a different list. You look at your list, you memorize, you register your retention on a little test, then you study it again. You study it again after the test. Well, Bem found across thousands of trials that future study improved present scores. He detected a cognitive retro-causal effect, Because again, as I alluded, and time keeps me from going into this in too deep a way, but I'm very happy to give another talk, and we can talk about the nonlinear nature of time. Time is a construct. It's a necessary construct. If you're told, well, gee, Mitch is going to give a talk at 11 a.m. Pacific time, well, I better be here at 11 a.m. Pacific time, or I'm going to be failing to keep my word. Time is absolutely necessary. It feels as viscerally real as my voice does to you right now. Of course, but it's not ultimate. It's not absolute. And we know this, again, from Einstein's now proven theories of time space. We know that time bends in certain circumstances, specifically in circumstances of extreme velocity when you're moving at or near light speed, or in circumstances of extreme gravity, such as what you might find in connection with a black hole. Now, astronauts in our own era, even though they're moving nowhere near the velocity of light speed, they do show measurable, minute, but measurable reductions in the aging process. The slowing of time is not just some thought exercise, it's actual. How? Well, I didn't say it was possible, I only said it's true, to adapt William Crookes. And it seems to me that what Bem has discovered is not only greatly important in terms of suggesting the nonlinear capacities of the psyche, but it's the first time, it seems to me, that a clinician, in this case a parapsychologist at a well-known university of high repute, working for 10 years to amass these statistics, it seems to me that he may be the first, or certainly among the first, clinicians to apply the question of non-linear time bending to cognitive performance. And the implications are staggering. The implications are staggering. I'm going to say more about that in just a moment. This data of Bem's, it's fantastic, right? Has it been replicated? Well, a group of professional skeptics reran Bem's experiments, and they rushed their own paper into print about a year later with the media-friendly title of Failing the Future. Bem's original had been called Feeling the Future. And they said, well, we reran 3 of Bem's experiments and they were a bust. They don't work. There's no precognitive, there's no retro-causal or a clairvoyant effect according to the protocols that he laid down. Well, okay. What the trio of professional skeptics did not reveal is that they had 2 affirming tests from other clinicians in their own open source database that they did not publicize. And when they pre-registered their experiments, they announced that they were creating an open source database where they would report any commensurate data that came from other clinicians. They had 2 affirming tests and 1 failed test in their open source database that, according to their own rules of the road, they were going to reveal. They did not reveal it. But it gets better. 10 years on, Bem's results were found replicatory in a meta-analysis encompassing of 90 different experiments in 33 different labs in 14 different nations. This does not mean that all or even a majority of those results proved replicatory, but a sufficient percentage proved replicatory so as to ensure, under the structure of meta-analyses, there was no chance of the results being attributable strictly to accident. Under the most conventional terms of the meta-analytic model, Bem's results were deemed replicatory by a wide statistical margin. Again, in a database consisting of 90 experiments in 33 labs in 14 different nations. And you will find on Wikipedia today and in any average media source the confident insistence that parapsychology experiments prove non-replicable. Don't let them sell that to you for a second. Don't let them sell that to you for a second. Every inch of data that I've been discussing today has proven replicable. And I got the numbers and stats and references to prove it coming from peer-reviewed journals and mainstream sources. As successful as the skeptical apparatus has proven on Wikipedia, in media, on campuses, we've got that at our back. And we got time. And we're going to keep working at it. And truth wants to be free. And we're getting there. We're getting there. So don't let anybody tell you that this material has not been replicated. Plain as day, it has been replicated according to standards that are higher than those used for many of our most popular pharmacological and social science studies. So dig this. Back to the practical. I'm going to close on the practical, because that's the point of our program today. BEM has provided statistically bulletproof data that presents to us the very real prospect of a spike in cognition based on activity that you and I perform in the so-called future. I want to tell you a quick story, and then I'm going to wrap. Several months ago, a Thai kickboxing fighter named Spencer Hadley came to me. He practices Muay Thai or kickboxing. And Spencer had a championship match coming up in the state of Texas. And he said, listen, I've been training and I've been training, and physically I'm in great shape and I feel good. But mentally, I wondered if you had any suggestions that could help me stay on my game. And I suggested to Spencer an exercise that I often prescribe called the 30-day mental challenge. It's super simple. It's just dedicating yourself to forwarding thought for 30 days. I have a book called the 30-day mental challenge. I have articles about it, but it's not much more complicated than what I've just described. And I believe in it. And Spencer said to me, well, I dig that and I will do it, but my match is only 9 days away. Do you have anything that's more short term? And I said, listen, I explained to him the BEM experiments, and I said, you do this 30-day exercise. Yes, your match is in 9 days, but we have data-supported reason. We have data-supported reason to suggest that cognitive performance, and I don't see why that wouldn't also include athletic performance, can be spiked in the so-called present by actions that we take in the so-called future. And I ask you to do this exercise with that in mind, because I can assure you, your opponent and his coaching team are checking out your every move. I can guarantee you your opponent is not being coached in retro-causality by his cornermen. Pretty good guess. So if you want an extra edge, I suggest to you, why are we doing any of this? Why is Daryl Bem gathering this information? Why is Emil Coué gathering this information? Why is J.B. Rhine gathering this information? Why is Honorton doing this? Well, aren't we all interested in expanding our conception of human potential, expanding our perception of what we as sentient beings are participating in, getting a better snapshot of reality, at least to the limited extent that our current findings are able to do so? So let's work together. Let's try it. Well, Spencer did try it, and he won the fight. You can see it. It's up on YouTube. He came out, his entry music, for those of you who watch mixed martial arts or kickboxing or what have you, you know, the fighters often, they pick their own entry music. They might come out to this pounding heavy metal or hip hop. And he came out to the Belinda Carlisle song, Heaven is a Place on Earth. And one of the announcers said, I love that he's coming out to Belinda Carlisle. It makes me so happy. He was relaxed. He was together. He won the fight. Now, he might have won the fight anyway, you know, but he certainly felt that participating in this exercise was a worthwhile experience. And I submit it to you, whatever walk of life you're in, whatever it is you're doing with your life, keep in mind what I've described to you briefly but accurately about the BEM exercises, because these exercises do demonstrate this parapsychological data, now long since replicated, a decade running, does demonstrate a spiked cognitive effect, a spike in cognition, cognitive performance, um, based on actions that are taken after the fact, suggestive of this porous nature, this nonlinear nature of what we call time, and the capacity of the psyche to possibly move among these different intersections of time and bring to you, the seeker, a performance and possibilities that might expand your conception of what it means to be human. And these are among the practical implications of parapsychology. So with that, I thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you today. It's been a tremendous pleasure. I'm sticking around. There's going to be some announcements from our friends at IONS, and I'll be here for questions and exchange. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitch. Yes, we'll give you just a moment to have a drink and breathe a bit while we share the latest here. In 2 weeks, on May 19th at 11 a.m. Pacific time, we will be welcoming IONS scientist Arnaud Delorme to Connections Live. And during this webinar, Arnaud will discuss the importance of studying big C consciousness, as well as offering a behind-the-scenes look into our new groundbreaking Linda G. O'Brien Noetic Sciences Research Prize. So we hope you will all join us for that. On Friday, May 26th, we will host Interconnections, a community event open to all IONS members. So members, look for your email invitation in the next week or so, and join your fellow Noetic explorers in fascinating conversation. Elena's going to chat that out. She already has. Nope, she's going to chat that out in just a second so that you can become a member if you would like to join us as well. And finally, IONS programs, as Mitch said earlier, as well as our scientific research, are entirely funded by the generous gifts of our members and our donors. So a big wave of gratitude to everyone who supports the mission of IONS. We are really, really grateful for your support. And if you've enjoyed today's offering, we invite you to go to noetic.org/give and make a gift. So that's it for announcements. We've got lots and lots of fabulous questions. So let's dive into some of those. Okay, let me find this one. Hard to find specific people, but there was a great one in here if I can find it. Well, let's start with this question from Daryl. Do you feel that the 21st century might be the time of parapsychology?
I do, and I don't say that lightly. I very, very rarely think or speak in terms of paradigm shifts. I have an allergy to the topic because we all tend to think that the generation that we live in must have something special about it, and I'm not so sure that that's ever been true. I mean, there are certainly generations that were on the precipice of something, good, bad, or some mixture. But that said, I think that our present moment is exciting. It's exciting in part because of a field that's adjacent to parapsychology, which is the study of the UFO thesis. I think that the UFO thesis has gone mainstream today in a manner that I would never have imagined even 6 or 7 years ago, and we're seeing it all around us. And I mean, it's a different field, but I'm interested because I think that broadening the psychology of experience is very important. And as that field has entered the mainstream mind, I think it opens up possibilities for us to chart non-traditional studies of experience in other areas as well. And the fact is, the field of quantum mechanics has now entered a phase where talking about the extra-physical or metaphysical implications of of quantum mechanics is now also very mainstream. I mean, whenever I talk about quantum mechanics, I know that there are members of the media and such who think, oh boy, here goes another new ager talking about quantum this, quantum that. And I tell them, look, if you think what I'm saying is far out, I'm conservative. I'm conservative. Get yourself a subscription to Scientific American, because what you find in there is more mind-blowing than anything I'm talking about. We are at a time and place where both clinicians, scientists, and educated lay people are considering the extra physical implications of quantum mechanics in a really informed and grounded way. And materialism as a philosophy, the belief that matter just creates itself and life is in accordance with strict Newtonian and chemical processes, and that's that. That approach, that philosophy, no longer covers the basis anymore. And I often say to people, look, the materialist model, the strict orthodox materialist model, it ain't going to go gently, and it ain't going to go away anytime soon, because it's made tremendous inroads into academia and mainline media and Wikipedia as a reference source. It's going to stick around for a long time. But it's in its twilight, if we can think in terms of generations, because it simply does not cover the basis anymore. What parapsychology needs more than anything right now is funding. As I said, the folks at IONS, the Rhine Center, elsewhere, they do all their own funding. The labs on campuses have, in numerous cases, closed down at Duke, at Princeton. Intrepid clinicians do carry on their own work, but sometimes, even if they do have jobs on college campuses, they still have to carve out space for that. So the field needs funding. We've lost, I think, a generation of progress because the professional skeptic apparatus has been successful in its media campaign to kind of disabuse us of these results, to persuade people, for example, that the things that we're interested in are non-replicatory or what have you, which is misinformation. So that fog is lifting, but the field needs funding in order to move forward. If the funding comes, yes, this could be the century we're looking for. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Stephen asks, are there exercises you can do to prolong the state of hypnagogia?
Yes, I believe so. I don't think that it's violative of the hypnagogic state to set an intention, as I do, to stick with it. That intention can be set at night. That intention can be set in the morning. I don't think it's going to prolong it a great period of time, because look, if you at a certain point, you're either going to slip into sleep or you're going to return to standard cognition. But I do think it's possible through intention to stay in it maybe a few minutes longer here and there. So that's been my experience. Yes.
Great, thank you. Let's see here. Is Neville Goddard's law of assumption an illustration of Behm's work?
That's a wonderful, wonderful question. Neville Goddard, for those of you who don't know, was one of the most remarkable, eloquent, magnetic figures from the New Thought tradition. Neville taught that all you see and experience around you is a result of the outpicturing of your own mental, emotive pictures. And I'm a big admirer of Neville. I think Neville was a very important mystical analog to a lot of this data. And Neville described his own method of visual creation, causation, which really involved hypnagogia. He would describe reclining, relaxing after lunch, and going into a state of hypnagogia. He didn't call it that, but he was describing the same thing, and using the visualizing faculties of his mind to determine a certain outcome. And then he would allow himself to drift into sleep. So I think Neville comported just perfectly with Emil Coué, and he does reference Coué briefly in some of his work, and he didn't name too many sources. I think that a good argument could be made, as the questioner proposes, for Neville's work to comport with Bem. I have. That's why I use the term selection rather than manifestation, which I don't find super clear. But I think that if, in fact, there are, and this is getting into a different subject area, so I'm only going to allude to it very briefly. But if there are different events playing out in different dimensions or intersections of time, which I think is one of the logical imperatives that we have to come to after 100 years of quantum mechanical experiments, then it could be that the psyche and the senses are tools of measurement, not much different from the tools of measurement used in the particle lab, and that the actual measuring of or registering of a moment in time actualizes an object or an event, whereas otherwise it might just be there in potential. I'm really, really compressing this, and you have to forgive me for that, but it would be a different talk, and a talk I'll be happy to return and give on the question of these different intersections of time, because I mean this in a very literal way. I'm not just using it as a fancy way of talking about energies or vibrations or what have you. I mean, I'm really trying to get down to brass tacks, but brevity restricts my exposition of all this. But my response to the question is yes. I think that what Neville is describing about mental causation, if it has validity, and I believe it does, corresponds with Bem's work and corresponds with work in particle physics, because I think it's possible that the psyche is selecting among different experiences in the same way that the physicist may well be selecting among different potential objects that are only there when measured.
Great, thank you. Existential Bob asks, can practice with lucid dreaming help in being more psychically receptive?
That's a wonderful question. I have never really worked with lucid dreaming. I am familiar with it. It hasn't been an area that I have made personal inroads in. So I tend to work more with hypnagasia. It just comes to me more naturally. So only because of my own paucity of personal experience with lucid dreaming, I can't speak to it.
Rick says, would you like to mention your Neville tattoo? He
Oh yeah,
says,
where
I'm
is that?
writing on the
Right.
pattern man.
Yeah, here we go.
Yeah.
There's the tattoo of Neville Goddard. Somewhere there it says "Live from the End," and has his name. Yeah, I've had that for a few years. I have a lot of people come up to me who are into Neville, uh, or who just want to know who the guy is on the tattoo. I've been asked about everyone from John F. Kennedy to Trump, and I said, no, it's Neville Goddard. So,
That's great. Um, Branch says, would you consider the Monroe Institute's gateway hemisync technology a way to induce hypnagogia? The Institute has so much data, yet it's seldom discussed or mapped to existing channeled entity book/information.
yes, and that's a great point, and I have to do a better job at that myself. I respect the work that they're doing at Monroe. The material that I've focused on, I emphasized only because it represents the area of my own deepest familiarity with the research. But you're right, and I have to do a better job of calling attention to the Monroe data. It's very important.
Thank you. Paula says, as a therapeutic touch practitioner using energy healing, we use our intention to create order, balance, and harmony in our healing partner's energy field. What can you say about the use of intention in the field of energy healing?
Well, it seems to me that intention and coupled with right circumstance is the royal road that leads to everything that we've been considering. One needs to have an intent, a target, an aim. Otherwise, our thoughts and possibilities from a psychical and physical perspective are just everywhere. And there needs to be the proper conditions, which seem to be hopeful expectancy, an atmosphere of warranted self-belief, and an atmosphere of comity among our colleagues and collaborators. And those things seem to correlate to results, whereas the opposite seem to correlate to negative results. And I emphasize, and I often say this to people, um, there should be a warranted self-belief, a warranted self-belief. We're not just trying to tell lovely stories to ourselves. One of the reasons why I work so hard to try to document parapsychology data as a layperson, communicating frequently with other lay people, is that I do believe that people have good reason to take seriously the extra-physical possibilities of their psyches. William James made the observation that he saw no reason why belief itself in some kind of deity or some kind of theistic belief in and of itself would not increase the effects and experiences concretely of this deistic or deific or theistic supposition in the individual's life. So belief in God or the beyond, however one wants to frame it, in a greater force, what have you, that in itself, James felt, could strengthen the actual concrete experiences of such phenomena in the individual's life. Okay, I take that seriously. That's why I care so much about trying to provide information on parapsychology, accurate information on parapsychology, to myself and other seekers, because I think it fosters a warranted, evidence-based self-belief, and I think that's a very important condition.
Thank you. An anonymous questioner says, in my experience, experimenting can be dangerous with appropriate trauma and spiritually informed care. The importance of considering the body and trauma that might be held in current and past life states needs to be considered. I'm curious if you could speak about ethics and harm that can happen and what you might suggest for supportive care.
Right. Well, as one of my mentors, Jacob Needleman, a philosopher who we lost several months ago, put it to me, the search needs to be exquisitely voluntary. First and foremost, I believe absolutely that there can be no compulsion behind any of this. I really believe very, very deeply in voluntary experience. Um, Personally speaking, a lot of my search is conducted in private nowadays. I have absolutely no grief against the group or the congregational model. In fact, I think that the group model can be extremely helpful, like in a support group or a 12-step group or something like that. But I do feel strongly that there should be no coercion, including soft peer coercion. I have been in circumstances as a seeker of like, we'll say like an encounter group type framework. And I have my questions about that. I also have my questions about, I do not dig theatricality. I don't dig circumstances, seminars, events and such, where people are maybe called out and expected to speak intimately in front of a group, because I don't know that that's appropriate, and that everybody wants to be disclosing at every moment. I may not be speaking directly to your question, but I do believe that voluntariness, privacy should be deeply respected. Intimacy should never be forced. One of the issues I have with certain growth centers and seminars is that they can, from time to time, create an atmosphere of forced intimacy, which I oppose. And I think the individual just needs to go at his or her own pace. If you're working with a counselor or a therapist or a medical professional, obviously there has to be tremendous trust and rapport. No one should be pushed past the point where they want to go. And be really careful. I would submit to you, if you're ever attending a residential a workshop experience, whatever it involves, I think that the catalog or the organization that's framing it should be super clear about what the activities are going to be, just so everybody knows exactly what they're getting into. I tend to be the kind of person who dives into the deep end of the pool. Um, that's just my way of doing things. That's not better or worse than anybody else's way of doing things, because as you're referencing, there may be traumas or areas that are profoundly delicate and must be treated as such. And I think that we as seekers, first and foremost, um, we need to, I think, be really, really careful never to succumb to the notion that that it's up to me to push someone out of his or her comfort zone. I challenge that. I challenge that. And I've left spiritual groups because I felt that assumptions were being made that someone was qualified to push another out of his or her comfort zone. I question that. And I think you always need to be around people with whom you feel very deep trust and rapport.
Maureen, regarding action taken after the effect, does it need to tie into the individual who had the original quote unquote cognition? Could, for instance, a group of people influence the past in a way to, for instance, avoid the First World War?
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating question. I mean, there's several implications there. First off, I would say that the BEM data, of course, did involve individuals and it involved cognition. I extrapolate from it that it can involve, if something has an impact on cognition, I would assume that something also has an impact on motor skill or athleticism or what have you. So I think it can be extrapolated to other any kind of cognitive or neuromuscular performance. Um, Group efforts have been studied, of course, in matters of prayer and intention. That wasn't part of BEM's data, so I wasn't referring to it for that reason. And of course, you're raising a fascinating existential question about whether an individual or group of people could avert a catastrophe like the First World War. I write about that in Daydream Believer, and I have two feelings about it. First of all, if our psyches are capable of choosing among different intersections of time, then it would stand to reason that such a possibility does exist. But it may be that war or any other catastrophe would still be playing out or would still be going on in some other intersection of time. So it wouldn't vanish once and for all, because there seems to be no such thing as once and for all, so much as we as individuals exist within an infinitude of potentialities that are localized through perception or measurement, including, I would say, psychical or biological measurement arising from our senses. But it's a fascinating question. And there's another psychological dimension to it as well, which I suppose occurs more on the personal scale. You know, one of the things I've observed is that if past, present, future are porous, if linearity is an illusion, and if we're ever selecting a sense of being through perception, it's possible that at every instant of life, including this one, we are all selecting a sense of past, present, future that feels as palpably real as the floor beneath our feet, and absolutely persuasive. And it is real, but it might be ever morphing and it might be ever changing. So I just submit that to you. It may be that we're doing this all the time as a human species and as individuals.
Well, thank you, Mitch. I want to give you just another moment for some last thoughts. And before I do that, I just want to send you my huge gratitude for taking this time to share this with our audience worldwide today. Gratitude to all of you for showing up. And for those of you who are watching this video at a later date, we really appreciate your energy and attention on what I think is a very important subject. So with that said, Mitch, would you like a few final words or thoughts?
Well, just first and foremost, Kirsten, want to extend a great thanks to you and IONS and all of your colleagues and the people who are with us today. I don't say this lightly. I give a lot of these talks, and this is just one of the most positive, engaged groups I've spoken in front of. And those of you who are making comments in the chat box, I'm seeing them, and I thank you. I leave the chat on during my talk. I want to see people's comments, and so everything you all have written is very much noted, and the questions are just brilliant and wonderful. And I feel absolutely certain that IONS is doing lots of things right, because gatherings like this with hundreds of people don't just happen. They grow out of a certain context. So I just want to express that to you and to everyone here today.
Thank you. Thank you for being a part of that special something. And we hope to see you all again very, very soon. Take care, everybody.
Thank you all. Have a great day.